BPD and addiction has always been heavily intertwined for me. Without substances, that shift from the void I experienced to extreme euphoria was always so extreme. Welcome to part 2 of the true cost of addiction. I go over my experience with BPD and addiction, what led to it in the first place, and how I overcame it, with DBT in mind especially. 78% of adults with BPD also develop a substance-related disorder or addiction at some point in their lives, according to the clinical literature. And it isn't without reason. If you just look at the criteria for BPD, addiction is even mentioned under criteria for impulsivity, substance abuse. And so the reason I became addicted in the first place was definitely due to my impulsivity, but more importantly, to kind of lessen the other symptoms, but by numbing them. Like balancing them out by kind of fogging my mind, if I'm being completely honest. It's as if I have two different minds when it comes to this. Like the addict mind that is impulsive, one-minded, and would just do anything to fulfill the need to relieve distress, by way of addiction in this case. And the second part, which was the clear-headed mind. And I feel like I was fully aware of my addiction when I was in that mind state, and they honestly work together to make it even more difficult to quit. To some degree, even perpetuated my unstable self-image. Always seeing my addiction in black and white was definitely just not the answer. And I kind of had to find that middle ground, that gray area where I could see it for what it was, both the good things and the bad things about it. And this definitely came from my symptoms. Cigarettes absolutely became the way that I coped with BPD. And now I don't want to go too in depth with my 9 symptoms and how I experienced them. I made a video just recently about that, so you can click on screen now and watch that. It goes into great lengths to explain what BPD is in the first place. And if you came from that video, welcome back. But yeah, to overcome my addiction, I simply had to make a plan. And I broke this into steps. I feel like that helps me a lot, having like a framework to follow. And I took a lot from the DBT skills workbook. I'll go over exactly what I used from that book, so you don't need to have it. It's a great book, but it's not necessary. With DBT, there's something called committed action. Essentially, it's where you kind of identify where you need to improve. And the way the book kind of puts that into a practical way for you to practice is simply by using these worksheets. So a component of my life that I value is, you kind of have to fill in the blank, and so I chose health. You also have to list your intention. Now, for me, my intention for why I value health is simply to live a happier and more fulfilling life. And this is where the committed actions come into play. So essentially, you list what you value, intentions behind it, but then breaking it down into actionable steps definitely helps. So for example, I chose running, focusing on eating healthier and cleaning up the house. And you might be wondering, what does this have to do with addiction? But simply every time I had these cravings, these pitfalls of my mind where all I could think about would be to go back to smoking cigarettes, I would look at this list. And I would just attempt to, do some of the steps that I had listed. This kind of ties into something called rehearsing value-based behavior, which is listed in the book as well. And you kind of have to look at the obstacles that comes up. Now, for example, when cravings come up for me, it's often tied to anxiety, and tiredness was a big one for me. And so breaking it down into steps, like when I crave a cigarette, look at the list of things I want to accomplish. Is it in alignment? No, it's not. Then do the opposite. And then in this case, it would be running. I would go for a run. And now I know you can't always go for a run when you crave a cigarette, right? That's not what I'm trying to say. But you have to make a list of things you can do that aligns with what you want to achieve in your life. And you can focus on that. And it helps tremendously, for me at least, to not have addiction in my mind all the time. Just having a checklist, so to speak, to follow instead. There's also a DBT skill called opposite action. And so if you feel the need to have whatever substance you consume, you can just not. And it sounds simple, but it's difficult. It's very difficult to do that. I found the more I practiced the skill, the easier it became to say no. But I will say in the beginning, when you're tired, when you're craving that cigarette, it's so easy to fall back in. It's so easy to take that step backwards. And so this is all the more important as to why you have to practice this step, especially. A different step I had to take was simply to surround myself with people that didn't smoke, that didn't consume nicotine or anything of the sort. And this isn't necessarily easy for me. Like, my siblings smoke, for example. So taking that step back in that relationship and being like, okay, look, I have to kind of be by myself for a while in the meantime. But it was absolutely necessary to kind of be around people who didn't share that addiction. I kind of created a new identity for myself, and at the expense of that, I kind of had to kill parts of my old self, the parts that would lean into my addiction. And there was definitely a grief that, came with that. Like, I definitely miss cigarettes. I still crave it at times, and the cravings are still difficult. But creating this step-by-step guide for myself, it helps immensely. It's kept me off the cigarettes for a long time now at this point. Longer than I'd lasted beforehand, I would say. But even then, life gets stressful, and you used to have a coping mechanism that you no longer have, and so I found rest increasingly important, and so this leads into the next step, which is kind of simple. I just call it timeouts. It's kind of like I just completely remove any distractions and take that time to relax. It could be going for a walk or doing the laundry or something where I don't have to focus on anything but the task that I'm doing, and it helps me stay in the present. Doing this when you're just in your normal happy space helps a ton. I found it like alleviated a lot of the stress surrounding quitting, especially because I don't relax that easily. I have a hard time not focusing on tasks all the time, but it definitely helped, and clearing your mind with a walk or whatever you deem fit can create a good amount of difference, and that's what you want to do. You want to stack every single chip in your favor. I created a step for that too. I took this part in the book called Self-Encouraging Coping Thoughts, and they give a list, and it's something like, I think one of them is, this too shall pass. I hear that a lot too. And another one is, the feelings are uncomfortable, but they will pass. These thoughts, even though they're kind of manufactured, I use them when it becomes a tad more difficult, when I feel that craving, like that extra bit that would make me fall back. But just having this framework and creating these new thoughts along the way, essentially it became like this bank of beliefs that, oh, I can actually overcome this. I know it might be difficult right now, but it will pass. And oftentimes I would have like these 20 minutes where my cravings and like the withdrawals would be absolutely horrible. And it definitely sucked, especially having BPD. Managing the symptoms at the same time is no joke. It's very fucking difficult. But you kind of have to accept where you're at. And oh, that's another one. My next step is actually radical acceptance. And if you're familiar with that, great. If you're not, it's kind of accepting everything about yourself and being completely honest. For me, that was, I was an addict and this plagues me so much. But embracing who I am and the flaws and all that is me. The reality of the addiction and all of that, coming to accept that was difficult, but definitely a very necessary step in the progress. It might bring guilt and shame, and you have to confront that too. You have to confront every single aspect of why you're addicted all at once you quit. And I think especially for those of us with BPD, that's the most difficult part of it all. Because all these guides, all these books, all this literature simply doesn't have to take that into account. Like BPD is such a small segment of society that targeted literature on something like this is not the easiest thing to create. That's like another step. You have to be able to confront your past, the reason you're addicted. You have to be able to confront every single aspect that is keeping you addicted. And this comes as a storm. It's very much so the most incredibly difficult part of addiction. It's that confrontation in the beginning. And so if you can learn to confront that, if you can learn to take it slowly and kind of giving yourself a pat on the back every once in a while, it helps tremendously. It really does. to kind of deal with that, the guilt, the shame, everything that is that, I also looked at creating new coping strategies. And I'm still building these up. They do not have to be perfect. It might be as simple as just playing video games all day if I'm having an especially bad day. And I know this sounds kind of ridiculous, like how can that help with addiction? But it doesn't have to be all that serious all the time. Sometimes you have to remember you're just a human. You can take time off, you can pursue something different, like even building Legos and stuff like that have been phenomenal lately. Also writing my book has been a way to cope. Like all these positive aspects kind of tie into these self-affirming statements that you can say to yourself. For example, it could be something as simple as, oh, I'm actually doing well today. Look at how much I've done. Stacking these small wins too, absolutely helps. Sorry, and I know I say this a lot, but it's been the only way that I've been able to quit so far. I've tried everything. I've tried substituting it for vaping. I've tried sins instead. I've tried everything. Patches, gum, fucking sprays, whatever, bro. Like, I've tried everything, but it kind of took me sitting down and creating a plan like this one to actually get over my addiction. There's definitely a pitfall that you might fall into with addiction, and so for that you have to create a emergency coping plan. I'll leave resources for that, but eventually the stress you're used to having an addiction to cope with will show up again. Like, life gets difficult, you will suffer in your life, that's not a question, but the question becomes, will you fall back into addiction because of that? 9 out of 10 times that I've fallen back into my addiction has definitely been because my life got hectic, it got difficult, there was something stressful that I did not know how to cope with. And so if you can create all these coping strategies, all that, great, but you need to have like an emergency stop button that keeps you from falling back. For me, this is as simple as moving my money to a different bank account so I can't access it, and therefore I'm not able to buy more cigarettes. And it gives me like a timeout for a day, because transfers take that amount of time here, to not fall back into it. And yeah, it sucks not being able to pay for whatever else that day, but it kind of gives me a timeout to not fall back into my addiction. And so there's also something different. This is more so, I think you call it physiological responses. It might be in the book too, I don't remember. But everything that you can do physically to distract yourself is great. I use this to cope with BPD in general, but something like ice cubes, like that temperature difference, for some reason calms me down a lot. And I know that goes for a lot of people, but just something as simple as that. Exercise, definitely running helps immensely, but also just, moving your body and not being in the same four walls, because realistically, with as much time as I spend inside, you get bored, you kind of have to move your body around to clear your mind. And with that said, I don't think I have more to say. This is just how I've been able to cope, how I've been able to overcome my addiction. And this really feels like the time. If you want me to delve into something very specific, leave a comment. Like, it could be something as simple as the void and addiction. I used to fill my void with my addiction, like, oh, if I'm not feeling anything, maybe a cigarette helps, and oftentimes it would, and that's like the best worst thing, right? I do have one last aspect to touch on, and that is, this is completely off the cuff, but self-destruction and self-sabotage definitely plays a role in that, in keeping an addiction alive. That's how I see it. I see it as something you can slowly dwindle out. Now, I know I will have cravings for a long time, but I know my self-destruction and self-sabotage will come up. It still does, and knowing how to deal with that is especially helpful, because I can see myself falling back. I don't think I will, because I've learned the skills to do that at this point. But yeah, I think that's very much so a very personal thing for you to explore. If you have any tips, for example, if you've overcome your addiction, leave them in the comments. Like, I would love to hear people that overcame their addiction as well. Because it's just not so simple when you have BPD as it is for other people. But I fucking love that. I love that we get to experience a different type of difficulty. I see it as a challenge. If you can frame your addiction as something that can be conquered, that you can win over, it also makes it into a game, and that's kind of important too. It's not that serious, but it is, but it's not, but it is. So face your addictions, and I really do wish you well on your journey, because it sure as shit is not easy. And yeah, but thank you for listening. This has been great. I really loved how I came to talk about this, honestly.